When we were talking to the executive committee about what this opening session should be, they're like, we want to be inspired and challenged and really reminded about why we're all here. And the Detroit folks said, we have just the person for you, though an amazing friend of D3, Reverend Simmons, who plays all of those roles for the D3 staff around inspiration and challenge. And holding us accountable to our values. So we have about a 45-minute session with conversation and hopefully some Q&A to hear some about this relationship and thoughts from Detroit before we break for lunch. So I will pass it over to you two, and you can take the table off if you want, whatever you're comfortable with. I think they come off if you want. Great.
That works. Is everyone hearing me? Yes. Okay, I can hear myself.
I think we did put your slide up if you wanted to. So.
Perfect. No worries. All right. More formally, I know I did a very quick hello. I'm Noah Urban, but welcome to Detroit, everyone. I'm Noah Urban. I'm the other co-executive director of Data Driven Detroit. And I'm just going to give a very quick preamble before I turn it over to Reverend Simmons to talk a bit about the work that he does in Brightmoor and the work that he leads out there. And then we'll have a bit more of like a fireside chat conversation to kick us off. So basically, for preamble, for background, when we were planning the theme overall for the NNIP conference, and I use the word we very broadly here because I was actually on parental leave for most of these conversations and did not participate. We're trying to figure out like what parts of Detroit do we really want to highlight. There's a lot of narratives out there about the city. A lot of them are good. There's America's comeback city. This is the Motor City. This is the place where Motown came from. There's all of these really strong positive narratives about Detroit. There's also really strong negative narratives about Detroit, too. The most blighted city in America, the most vacant city in America, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what a lot of those narratives really leave out is the fact that this city for 640,000 people is home. And it has been home through all of those major changes that have happened over the past 50, 60 years. And a lot of times the voices of those residents are not necessarily reflected in those more economically driven stories about the city. And we wanted to provide an opportunity for those voices to be heard in this session. And who better to do that than our longtime partner, Reverend Simmons, who I've known, I think, for the entire time. I've been at D3 for around 11 years now, and the relationship goes back even farther than that, too. So yeah, we just wanted to give a chance for you to talk about your work, share, and then we can just talk about the partnership and go from there.
Sure. What up, Doe? Welcome to Detroit. I always want to acknowledge the Anishinaabe people who were the original residents and occupants on the land on which we currently sit and meet. I'm not going to try and get into the story of what became of them. Those of us who seek the truth, it's not hard to find. But before any of us came to this continent, they were here, meeting at this bend in the river called the Strait by the French, Detroit, and now Detroit. So let me tell you a little bit about this land that we sit upon. My name is Reverend Larry Simmons. I am, by way of background, I'm older than 97% of the people alive in the world. How's that for some dinner conversation? The Brightmoor Alliance is celebrating 25 years next month. That's going to be significant in a minute, and I'll tell you why. But over the course of the evolution of the Brightmoor Alliance, it has identified a number of different initiatives. We finally settled on what you see across my chest: building abundant food, shelter, clothing, and hope. And for those of you who remember your Economics 101, the system by which we produce and distribute food, shelter, and clothing is economics. And so much of what you will see as you tour Detroit, and I took a look at your tour, if you want to understand what it is, race certainly plays a part in this, but you have to look past that to the economics. Why did the Anishinaabe come here to meet? Because the river was close and they could trade their goods here. Why did the French come here? Because the river was narrow and they could trade their furs here. Why did Detroit emerge here? Because the lumber industry could bring their lumber here, transport it through the Great Lakes. By the way, did you know you're sitting inside 75% of all the fresh water in North America right now? That's going to matter. And so when you look at the history of our city, you always have to look at the economics. The people that you see here who've been here a long time are the children and grandchildren, and in some instances great-grandchildren, of automobile workers who were bought out in the 80s when the automobile companies began to downsize. In 1950, there were 107, I believe I have this number right, approximately 100,000 people working at Ford Rouge. They lived in Detroit, and they also lived in Brightmoor. And today there are, depending on who you ask, 3,000 or 7,000 people working there. 107, 3 or 7,000 today. The folks who are here are now the third or fourth generation of those who we call by various names. We call them poor, we call them low income, we call them living under the poverty line or some percentage of the poverty line, 100% of poverty, 150, 200. All of those names apply to the same folks. And they happen to be the people that I represent in Brightmoor. Brightmoor is a community of about 7 miles square. There are 22,000 people who live there, depends on whose definition of the boundaries you accept. The median income, which is what's shown up here on this graphic, is $27,000 a year. I usually have to explain what the median income is, but I trust I don't have to do that here. Okay, okay. The MSA for Detroit extends along the lake, Erie, the river, and down to Monroe. It does not include Ann Arbor, does not include Oakland County, if I'm recalling correctly. So the large picture here is that I come from a community which is extraordinarily poor. It's low income. It is, depends on who you ask, but it's about 33% of the area median income. The median income in Detroit is only $37,000. Brightmoor is 20. Area median income, which is the other number you see circled up here, is $71,000. Depends on which year, HUD puts out the number. It fluctuates around $70,000 a year. Enter D3. This partnership has been phenomenal because many of the numbers you've just heard me cite has come from them. And not only did the numbers come from them, but in my conversations with them, they have pushed back against some things that I have said. They have taken in some things I have said and used it as a basis to do further study. It has been an extraordinarily rich exchange, which has begun to shape the direction of the activism of the neighborhood in which I live. One of the problems with describing people as poor is that it is a hopeless designation. Because who can solve the problem of poverty? And then people, being a preacher, I can do this, people would then say, well, Jesus said the poor will always be with you. Well, he did say that, but he wasn't talking about nothing you could do about the poor. He was making the point that I'm about to die and you won't have a chance to take care of me. You'll have an opportunity later to deal with the poor. A little exegesis for those of you all who didn't go to church last week. So this this way of describing Detroit is a defeatist perspective. What we have evolved, thanks to the help from D3, we say we are living in a hole. The top of the hole is $71,000 a year, median income, area median income, and the place where half of our people are standing is $27,000 a year, even though there are people who are lower. That gives you a very simple, powerful visual that people can then say, so what are we doing? We are climbing out of the hole. When we say building something, we're building ways out of this hole. It's not easy, it's not quick, we don't promise easy victories, and we don't tell lies. So what I would say to you, and I want to open this up for questions, those of you who are seriously thinking about working with the communities from which you come, I hope that you bring the respect. I hope you put some respect on the circumstances that the people that you may not see every day are living. My degree is actually in computer science, believe it or not. I wanted to be a nerd. God wouldn't let me. But one of the things I will tell you, and I'm not trying to offend anybody, but in my classes in computer science, generally I was the only African American present. There were two groups of coordinated students. One was white male, the other was Indian. What I did not learn until my senior year in school, which was a long time coming, that's a whole other story, was that these two groups had figured out that the professors were alternating their tests every year. So if you had the even year tests in your file, wouldn't help you in the odd number year. But come the next even numbered year, you had a leg up. So I'm up in the lab and in the library. They had what they call a remote job entry then. That's long before you all. And we would have to go down there. I literally would get there at 7 in the morning when they opened, and I wouldn't leave until 11 at night, sitting there trying to code with these cards on key punch machines. Look it up when you get home. While my classmates were out at the club switching tests with each other. My point is this. Because, one, I think it helped me master the craft, but more importantly, the game of education, I was behind. And my colleagues in class were ahead because they had people who were helping them manage the game of school. Because you do know school is a game. I'm not hurting anybody's feeling here, am I? I hope it is a game. That's another discussion too. So, as you go back and deal in the communities that you deal with, you're going to find that for those communities of color, there's a preponderance of people who are living in the hole. It's unlikely unless you are one of the, and whites live in the hole too. It's unlikely unless you've had that experience, you know what that means. I'm going to give you one example and I'm going to quit. Let's say you decide you're going to go wash your clothes. So you gather up all the clothes, particularly like Noah here, you got new children, you're doing this a lot. You go downstairs, or you go to the laundry room, or if you don't have those, you get in the car and you go to the laundromat. Take the clothes, take the stuff you wash with, wash the clothes, dry them, fold them, come on back home, finish watching the Lions barely win a game they should have blown out yesterday. Let me take you down into the hole for clothes washing. Got to find somebody to watch the kids or take the kids with me. I got to get up enough money to go to the laundromat. I've got to have enough money to pay somebody to take me there and to bring me back, because I don't have public transportation in Detroit is like non-existent. So for you, then I've got to trust that whoever brought me there is actually going to be available to bring me home. So what for us is an hour-long, hour-and-a-half-long chore, for somebody who's making life work in the whole, it's a process. It's a project. And so when you call a meeting for the community to come and hear your brilliant analysis of where they live, and only 5 people show up and 4 of them are as old as I am, it's because the other folks are at home managing washing the clothes or cooking dinner. So if you want to present information to them and your insights, you have to be willing to change the way you do what you do and to change the language you use to describe it. So if you come in talking about the AMI and the MSA and the history of the development of these measures, and the central tendency of this data is to express what most people are likely to do, but the kurtosis of the graph suggests that there is a deviation from the fill in the blank. They will glaze, they'll stop. But you put up a picture of a man helping his children up over a ladder that has $10,000 increments and tell them the circle is where you are now, the 71 is where we're going. Everybody will get that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So we are going to have some questions from the crowd, but I have a couple of just quick questions to tee up with you first. So I'm wondering, like, you kind of already answered it in some ways around like the power of narratives to kind of shape and reach people. I'm wondering, could you share an example of a time when like sharing this kind of a narrative, like with the data and everything, has kind of helped, whether it's with funders or policymakers or something, kind of just shift how Brightmoor is perceived?
I don't know if I've changed the way Brightmoor is perceived. that's
Changed it for me, I think, for sure.
Oh, okay, well, good.
Mm-hmm.
Good. I'll take that. America is not very sympathetic to those who are living at the level of income that Brightmoor has. We have a culture that thinks that you grab yourself by your bootstraps and you pull yourself up. We tend to believe that people who aren't where we are, it's because they didn't study when they were in school. They didn't try hard enough. They really, they aren't smart enough. I had an economics instructor once said there were 2 kinds of people in the world. One are the people who say, hey, you, and the other kind are those who answer. Hey, you, the people who answer are the other people in the world. That was taught in a college-level economics course. So there is this breeding that we do, this worldview that we tend to do about those who are poor. So what we have begun to do, and D3 has helped us with this, is to begin to look at the numbers and begin to say, okay, this is a characteristic of, this is a generalization about the neighborhood. The 27 is not, and you know this, is not a full description of the demographic of the neighborhood. But there are these little salient points, like 9% of all the single parents in the neighborhood are men. None of our work, me and my colleagues, I call it the helpers, we're talking to men as single parent heads of house. Another statistic, and you can find this in the portal that D3 has about Brightmoor, is that we have a very large number of young children below the age of 3. So what's happened is Brightmoor has become known as the place in Detroit with the most skilled early childhood community in the entire city. That's a result of D3's partnership with the Fisher Foundation and a group of women who were doing babysitting and daycare. And between their data, Fisher's encouragement and resources, and the determination of these women, they have now become business owners. And now I think it's like the 9th year of the BQI. They are now training the next generation of business owners and are actually diversifying and going into other businesses. Those are changes. I don't know if it's changed the narrative about Brightmoor with everyone, but it has certainly made Brightmoor a place where people look for innovation. And the last thing I would say, and this didn't come from D3 exactly, but the Fisher Foundation did a study called the Wilder Study. You can find it on the Brightmoor Alliance website. You can find it on the Fisher Foundation website. And the quick number is that the Wilder study said that you can save $100,000 per child if you get a child in early life ready, school ready, by the time they go to kindergarten. We brought that number to the community, and they evolved this set of behaviors called 6-a-days. 6-a-days basically are things that most parents do. Talk to your child, play with your child, sing to your child. What is significant is this simple, and again, this is always our point, this simple, doable prescription has now been adapted citywide by the early life community, and has now been translated into 4 different languages and is being taught in the Middle East. Came out of Brightmoor, the place that most people would say, like they said of Jesus in Galilee, no good thing can come out of Brightmoor. Not true. And it's not true in your community. You just have to be willing to go and see it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's always like really impressed me about Brightmoor, because I came from urban planning school. We did studies of the different neighborhoods in Detroit, and as a young impressionable grad student, I was like, wow, Brightmoor is a very, like from the data point, it's a very challenged area. But I think the Fisher Foundation saw something special there. I think your organization leads something special there, and that's what we really wanted to try and highlight through this conversation. And I think the other thing I would like to ask you too, though, is what about a situation where the data didn't necessarily help, or a situation where you've kind of had to
not talk about it?
Well, not talk about it, or yeah, where I mean,
flip that page.
Yeah.
Not really. One of the advantages of being in a place like Brightmoor, where everybody thinks everything is universally bad, is the thing you have to emphasize is what isn't bad. I'm trying to think of a time when there was a data point, something that you all offered that was negative or we had to push back on. Nothing honestly comes to mind. You asked me this before when we were talking about this. There have been things, I'll give you an example. If you look at this graphic on the wall, I wrestled with like 3 or 4 different kinds of versions of this. And I remember sharing one with my staff, and they said, you know, that hole looks like a woman's uterus. This is a true story. I said, what are you talking about? It was one of the female staffers. Said, that looks like a picture of a uterus. I said, I guess I need to change this. I shared another one with the staff at D3, and they said, well, you know, your proportions are really off. You might want to do some juggling around. So we finally arrived at this, which doesn't purport to be a graph per se. It's a graphic, and it's intended to convey an idea. And what I would say is you have to, it's like tuning an old-fashioned radio or a shortwave. You kind of have to twist the dial a little bit to make the information come across clearly. It's not always evident. I say we because I'm a nerd. We wrestle with these numbers so much, we almost feel them. I'm assuming I'm talking to a group of people who've had this experience. My previous background was in politics, and I used to do the data for Coleman Young and the polling. And it got to the place where I could feel neighborhoods through the numbers of the election, through the turnout numbers, through who they voted for. I could tell when something was moving in the community different than it had between that poll, the election results, and the next one. And then there were times when people with data would try and tell us something which just didn't make sense. And so I evolved this saying that you have to let yourself be informed by the data, but not impaled by the data. Be informed by the data. Be instructed by the data. Don't get impaled by the data. Let the data breathe and speak to you and see what is the story that it's telling and what's behind it. So I don't have a bad news story for you, Noah. We haven't had it.
That's good. Maybe one then additional question, and you can feel free to plead the fifth if you want to with this. How about in terms of working with like others, like the city and other stakeholders, and how does data, how does all of that play in with your experiences? Does it help? Does it not? All of those fun things.
There's somebody from the city here, and they didn't identify themselves. I can feel it. Seriously. Politicians and data are kind of like men and I love you. Think about it a while and you'll get it. If they're trying to get something, they will tell you things or not. And with the city, every elected official wants to be reelected. And so they will tend to pivot the use of information in a way that's most likely to get them elected. I have found with the Duggan administration, however, and I will give them credit for this, from the moment Mayor Duggan came in, he began to use data to describe how the city is doing. In fact, one of the things he said, I remember at his first community meeting, which he held in Brightmoor, he said, I want you to judge me by one number, which is a pretty bold statement. I want you to judge me by whether or not the number of people moving into the city has increased. Now, you have to understand, Detroit had been in a decline of people leaving for at least 3 censuses. Back to when I was with Coleman, I remember we had a big fight with the Census Bureau about whether or not the city still had 1 million people in it. That would have been the 1990 census, I think it was, because I wasn't working for him until '83. So that would have been that 90 census. But it had started probably, well, the decline in the city actually began after, just before 1950, and it accelerated later in the century. So when Mayor Duggan stands up and says, judge me on whether or not people have moved into the city, I was like, are you crazy? You know, you find something like, have I picked up a ton of garbage? You know, of course you've picked up a ton of garbage. You pick up 10 million tons of garbage a year. Of course you got one. But it was a bold statement. And in the last census, Detroit's population had gone from decline to up by 1,000 or thereabouts. You would know that number better than me. But whatever it was up. So in fact, it took him 4 terms. He had successfully turned the number. I credit the city, and I commend them, that they do use data to help them decide what to continue and what to stop, more than most. How's that for a political answer?
That was very politically appropriate, yes.
Is that correct?
Politically astute, yes. Excellent. Yeah, and I mean, I'm curious and wondering too, because I know there's pressures within the city. You know, like there's pressures for allocating funding. Has data been an asset in kind of advocating for Brightmoor in that way? Have you?
Yes.
Or has it been other? What? Yeah, if you expand.
The city is doing a huge water diversion project in the city on the east side and the west side, and Brightmoor is one of the focus areas. Brightmoor is probably the only area in the city characterized by lots of hills and valleys, and that landscape is ideal for collecting stormwater and diverting it out of the sewer system. And one of the things that's happened, talking about data, is that we were able to convince the city to use its community development part of the grant to focus on workforce development. And we used data, your data specifically, although I gotta say, everybody wants to shade the data their own way. I mean, is there really a big difference between $37,000 a year and $35,000 a year median income? I mean, does life substantially change when you get that other $2,000? But it was your data, which they pirated off our website, which is linked to you. So the approach that they took, but the good news is they agreed that this was a priority and it's going to be included in their proposal to the feds, which has a good chance of being passed. Because every time it rains a half an inch throughout the city, it overwhelms the sewage system, and so they have to open up the pipes at the river, and raw sewage pours into the Detroit River, which is a throughway to multiple states and the Great Lakes, and is a huge problem, and the city gets a big fine every time it happens. So it's very likely this grant will be approved, and as a result, many people in Brightmoor are going to get the opportunity to have job training close to their proximity as a result of the data we were able to provide.
Awesome. All right, I think we're going to open it up for questions now, but is there any last pearl of wisdom you would like to share for the folks here, or anything before we move on to that?
I would just say, you don't know, ask.
Excellent.
Ask. There is a me in the community you came from. I don't know her. I don't know them, but they're there. Go ask if you don't know. That's the only thing I would say.
Thank you. Any questions, thoughts, comments? Yeah.
To not use this. Thanks for your discussion and ground setting here. It was really helpful. This question is more for Noah. I'm wondering how the partnership with Brightmoor, if it's led to any shifts in how D3 does its work, and what does positioning the community as experts look like in your organization?
Yeah. It has led to, I think, a lot of shifts. And this kind of traces back to D3's own organizational history as we were founded, went through a variety of growing stages, and really around like 6 years ago or so, I think we started to emphasize a lot more of the user-centered approach in the work that we're doing. So working closely, I mean, we've always worked closely with the Brightmoor Alliance, but like doing user testing sessions on our data tools with them, doing trainings, it's focused, it's oriented us much more along that line to make sure that the information we're providing actually works for you and is supporting you in your work. Because really, we can throw out all the numbers into the world, and as Reverend Simmons said, the residents will glaze over, the politicians will shape them to do whatever they want. But if we actually can find those specific partners who can use this information to then drive good and drive positive change in their neighborhoods, that's really like that sweet spot, that group of organizations that we want to hit the most and serve the most. So I think it's been very instructive. And Erica, since you've been around in the Brightmoor Partnership longer than I have, if you want to add anything more there as well, feel free.
I guess I would add that going to live through probably the third revolution in America. If we take the American Revolution as the first, you could go back and say the arrival of Europeans to America might be considered the first revolution. That's another discussion. The American Revolution, the Civil War, and what is happening here. And I don't mean this in the sense that there's going to be a war, although there very well may be. But the way we produce food, shelter, and clothing is forever changed. We manufacture things now with computers. You can do it in your house. We share, I mentioned to you the RJE when I was working on mainframes as a student. What that RJE did, I can do with my phone. I can do more with this phone than I could do with that mainframe from 1970s and 80s. This is a fundamental shift. One of the data points, D3 didn't give me this one. Do you know that 2% of the American population makes food for the other 98%? Think about what that implies. If you don't need the other 98% to make food, what do you need them for? Extrapolate that idea out to cars. 100,000 people used to make cars at Ford, 3,000 people make them today. What do you need the other 97,000 people for? You can make similar arguments as you move throughout the entire American economy. Actually, it's going on in the whole world. But you can make that case as you move throughout the American economy of large numbers of people who are no longer necessary to produce food, shelter, and clothing. So what, as demographers and statisticians, data producers, how do you describe this phenomenon? How do you capture this? How do you say what it is we are becoming? How do you quantitatively present that in a way that people can see what it means to come out of the hole? The other point I would make about this graphic, it just occurs to me. The whole point of putting the $10,000 increments there is so that you don't create a win or lose scenario. So just because the person doesn't make it to 71 doesn't mean they haven't come a long way up if they make it to 51 or to 41 or to 61. I want you to think about how you can talk to your community that you live in. You're going to go to a number of places in Detroit, then I'm going to shut up. You're going to go to a number of places in Detroit. And everybody's talking about how Detroit's on the comeback. But you know what nobody has said? Nobody has said what Detroit is going to do to make a living to replace the automobile industry, which caused us to go from about 200,000 people in 1900 to nearly 2 million people in 1950. And now 600,000, but they didn't leave, they're just spread out throughout the entire Southeast region. What is the replacement industry? What is going to have to change to accommodate all of us in a place where 98% of us are not needed? In fact, if you take the entire food chain, I think I got this number right. If you take the entire food chain, you know, everything from Ma and Pa, growing tomatoes, to Campbell's, which is no longer soup, if you take that whole chain, it's only 15% of the population. All in. 85% of the population is doing something else, or not. You got to describe that.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, so, I'm good.
Okay. Any other questions? I think we have time for one or two more.
Well, I got a question. Nobody got a question for me. Why did you all get into this? If you're smart enough to do this, you could have gone and made money in the private sector. Why are you doing this? Seriously, no. I mean, really.
Fair question. Any takers?
Go get the bag.
I can only speak for myself. I'm always looking for good trouble.
Did you hear what he said? He said, I can only speak for myself. I'm always looking for good trouble.
I'll do the question with another question, all right, if you don't mind. Because I know I do think your question is valid in terms of like the purpose and the why of someone, right? So I think for me is, I think that everyone deserves an equitable and transformational experience regardless of where they live or where they come from. That's my personal why, right? But then much of what we're thinking about is system change, and system change takes a long time. You gotta be very patient, and I feel like I can see what success looks like, but the people around me, they want to change now, right? And I almost think also the next generation wants to change now. So my question for you now is, as you're engaging with communities, as you're engaging with perhaps people that can support your vision, what does, because I see it's food, shelter, clothing, hope, but you also talked about education. You also talked about other aspects. In a perfect world, like if we were to like forward years from now, you can decide how long. What would you want to see beyond the numbers that you see here? What is like the Brightmoor Alliance look like, or what your service looks like years from now, and what do you think is needed today to make that happen beyond what you described today?
There are two answers to that question. One is the optimistic one, and one is the pessimistic one. I mentioned that I was going to talk about the Brightmoor Alliance being 25 years old. Many of you who are much younger than that, you've grown up with community-based organizations or something akin to us your entire life. I'm old enough to remember when those things did not exist. There was no such thing as a community-based. There were charities. There were not halfway houses. There were these houses where people could go and get food or clothing. I'm blocking on their names, but there were not this notion of the community taking charge of its own development. Here is the optimistic. Maybe I should start with the negative one. The negative one is we continue allowing the people who have 95% of the wealth in America continue to refuse to find a way to share it with the other 99%, and the nation erupts into violence and bloodshed because people are feeling the squeeze at the bottom. That's one path. The other path is they listen to you, and they realize that they could literally give up 10% of their wealth, still be fabulously rich for generations, and they find ways to bring into the workforce that other 85% that's no longer needed to make food. And your numbers help them to find ways to do that. I don't believe in giving away money. I've done it in my career. I don't believe in giving it away. But here's the question I put to like I just asked you the question, here's the question I put to my colleagues, and they got really mad at me. I said, how much? They were all bragging about how they had celebrated their 40th anniversary, their 50th anniversary, their 25th anniversary. And I said, When are y'all going to go out of business? They got mad. We're always going to need our... Well, if you're always going to need, then you're confessing failure. Because if our stated, and all of us got, we got these really fancy mission statements, right? Vision statements. Brightmoor is an innovative community where people of modest means can live, learn, and work in a culturally diverse and sustainable environment. Nobody, including the people who work for me, knows that, can recite that vision to you. Nobody. That's how we wound up with this. I started talking to people in the neighborhood, and this is what they told me they were looking for. And this goes to the question of education. That's where the hope is. When you started school as a freshman, you had no idea what you were going to be able to do to make a living when you got done. Education is the essence of hope. You start early, you endure all the stuff you endure through however many years you endure it, because you believe at the end of that process, even though there's no proof, you have the hope that you're going to be able to make a difference in the world. That's where education lies for us. That's where the hope is. We believe that by finding partners who share the vision that all people can have this, that we can find a way to make it happen. I can't tell you what that is. When I'm rolling around at this conference, the national NIP, I said I was going to use that on you all. When I'm rolling around the national NIP in 45 years, how's that for optimism? Then I expect to hear you talk about how you've done it, because I think that's what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to tell that story to people who have control of the bag, the real bag. Do you know the United States economy is $27 trillion a year, is growing at the rate of 4% a year? Do you know how much money that is? We are not poor. This is not a poor country. You could take the growth and solve most of the human challenges in America that the United States has in 1 year and spread it out over time. We just don't have the will and the courage. Nobody has told the story in a way that the folks who hold the big bags are willing to participate in. I'm hoping that you can do that. Actually, more than hope, I believe that you can do that. The reason I'm here is because I'm hoping to encourage you to reach back to your constituents. You heard me say, tell no lies and promise no easy victories. My message to the Brightmoor community is you need a 25-year plan. I have a lady who's in one of our organizations who's 90. She is, actually, she'll be 91 in a minute. She's 14 years older than me. So I'm saying to the community, I don't care if you're 65, get a 25-year plan, you'll be as old as Shirley. What are you going to be doing? It will not happen, as you correctly point out. It will not happen quickly, but it won't happen at all if we don't push against it, talk about it, raise it, elevate it, do things that look like uteruses when they're supposed to look like a hole. I guess a uterus is a hole, but not in the sense that we were talking about. But we're going to fail a lot. We're going to stumble a lot. We're going to make mistakes a lot. But we're also going to learn a lot. And one thing you can say, many things you can say to criticize America, but one thing we are is we can invent the heck out of stuff. Y'all going to invent it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Noah. Appreciate you, brother.
That was a great challenge, I think, for all of us. We can invent the heck out of things over the next 3 days. I think, Leah, is the food in the, food is in the Bala room for, and come through. Okay, so close, yeah, so please go out the front door, stand up, stretch your legs anyway, and go into the front of the Bala room make sure those doors are open, and then and gather your food to eat. Or you could stop and while there's a big line, check out the camp sessions, add one, maybe one was suggested just now, vote so we can pick the sessions for this morning. Katie Pritchard and Camille Seabury are helping to do the selection too, if you want to start lobbying for your favorite. So we'll see you back here in an hour or so.